Welcome to today's episode of Medical Ethics Unpacked. I'm Steve Levine, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Dr. Dominic Sisti. We are also very honored to have a special guest with us today, Dr. Amy McGuire, JD, PhD, probably some other degrees, recent attendee of the Houston Rodeo, and probably more relevant, the Leon Jaworski Professor of Biomedical Ethics and Director of the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine. What happens when you put two ethicists and a psychiatrist in the same Zoom room? Let's find out. Today's episode is all about psychedelics. This isn't a new subject in the sense that most likely from the dawn of human existence, people all over the world have been consuming plants and fungi to alter their perceptions within a variety of contexts. In the mid-20th century, chemists began to synthesize psychedelic compounds, and researchers explored their therapeutic applications. Although this work was prolific, most was not conducted to modern research standards, and then was mostly extinguished with the passage of the Narcotics Act and Controlled Substances Act in the early 1970s. This research has been reawakened in the past 20 years, applied to a broad range of mental health conditions and existential distress. Today, people are accessing psychedelics for personal use in underground settings, through emerging state-level adult use models, as participants in research, and potentially within the next few years as FDA-approved drugs that may be paid for by insurers and delivered by licensed healthcare providers. This means that physicians and other healthcare providers, whether they're aware of it or not, are already caring for patients who are using psychedelics, may be asked questions by these patients, and may be faced with decisions in the not-too-distant future about prescribing or referring to psychedelic treatments if they are approved. This raises a whole host of juicy ethical considerations that I'm excited to dive into with my ethicist expert friends today. So Don, Amy, where should we begin?
Thanks, Steve. That was great as an intro. And Amy, why don't we just start by hearing from you and how you, I think the personal background you have in psychedelics and how you got into this space as a bioethicist would be wonderful to hear about. And then we can kind of dive into the deeper ethical issues.
Yeah, thanks, Dom. So it's great to be here with both of you. Thanks for having me on. Where to begin? I think there's sort of three facets to why I'm working in this space. The easiest answer from a professional perspective is, I've spent the last 20 years working on ethical and policy issues at the intersection of emerging technologies, novel therapeutics, and science policy. And I'm really attracted to those spaces where sort of the science is moving really quickly, public is super enthusiastic, and kind of the ethics and policy seem to be lagging behind. And this is certainly, in today's day and age, one of those spaces. But at a deeper level, I think there's two things that really drive me to this space. One is, and I like to call this sort of my why of why I'm doing this work. And it really has to do with my three children who are three sons in their 18, 22, and 24 years old. And I've just watched over the last 5 or 10 years as they've grown up as adolescents in our country and in our society, sort of the devastation of our mental health crisis on our youth, and how difficult that is to watch. My kids have multiple people that they know who have died of suicide and died of drug overdose, self-medicating. And I think we're in the midst of a real existential crisis. And so the mental health burden that I think we all feel, most of us have been touched by, is really an important problem for us to address. And psychedelics is one way that there seems to be some movement forward in trying to address that. And then sort of my deepest reason that I'm in this space is that I've spent the last 30 years on and off, working with indigenous communities, many of whom have used psychedelic substances, what they call them spirit medicines, for millennia, and how that has shaped sort of their worldview in terms of how we are in relationship with the earth, with the plants, with the spirits, with each other. And I think that that's a real key to healing individually and collectively.
Thanks for sharing all of that. And I think, as we all can hear, you are deeply connected to this subject and deeply experienced in thinking about it and working within it. So I'm really glad to have you as part of this conversation today.
Thanks. It's great to be working with some experts. It's fun to collaborate with you guys. And Steve, you're at the forefront of sort of the science behind this. And really have informed the field a lot and sort of what we understand about how these substances work biochemically and from the perspective of treatment for mental health conditions. So thank you for your work on that.
Thank you.
I have a quick question we can start off with, Steve, if that's okay.
Please.
This might frame things out a little bit for us too. Amy, I'm curious if you think psychedelics present exceptional challenges, ethical challenges that other psychiatric treatments don't present. I mean, are they special? Is there something we need to really worry about here, or are we kind of just spinning our wheels about standard bioethical questions? And maybe as an example, we can just kind of talk about informed consent in the clinical setting or different issues related to research ethics that come up with psychedelics.
Yeah, so I don't know if you're asking me this, Dom. You probably have the most to say about this, because I think you've written directly, particularly around issues of informed consent. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and I'm happy to chime in with my thoughts about it.
Well, I mean, I think, it not so much focusing on informed consent, but just like the question of, are these medicines exceptional in some way that require a different kind of bioethics? And I think, we've gone back and forth on this question like many times. My view is that they are different in many respects, but mostly not. Mostly they're the same, and mostly the ethics are going to be the same, whether we're talking about informed consent or boundaries, or access and equity in research contexts. I think the difference is the rapidity of the effect often for people. Like an SSRI or other standard treatments, right? They start to kick in after a week or two, and you might feel relief from symptoms, but like psychedelics seem to really transform people kind of almost not instantly, but quickly. And I've heard people describe the experience as almost like packing in a couple of years of therapy into like one day, right? In the best scenario, there's always going to be, adverse outcomes and things that don't go right. We can talk about those today as well. But like, it feels like that is a big difference when a person's kind of transformed almost overnight and has a whole different set of a whole different worldview, maybe even, or set of values that like were fundamental, they thought, but then were just kind of adjusted or changed like by a psychedelic experience. And so I think that brings with it a lot of like, ethical issues about how do we prepare people for something like that. So I think that's the aspect where it's maybe exceptional. I mean, there's other areas of medicine where that kind of transformative thing happens also, obviously.
Other areas of life too, right? Life-threatening illness, near-death experience, childbirth,
Right.
Well, I think that, I think also and again, there, to me, it's the combination of the altered state of consciousness that it brings you into. And then the way I like to think about it is that I think that they can be used in exceptional ways. So ceremonial use of these substances, I think, is quite different. Now, whether we think they're different or not, I think it's a separate question of whether they should be treated different as we go through sort of the FDA pipeline, as we go through standard sort of clinical practice. So if they're adopted into Western medicine and, we're going through traditional within Western medicine pathways of using these drugs, I'm not so sure that there should be exceptional rules related to them. But I think that, not to acknowledge their distinctive features and their potential to be used in really different types of ways is, would be a mistake. I also think that there's a lot to be said about that. There's this really deep, rich, reverent, ancient wisdom that comes with these substances that we don't see with most drugs and drug products, right? And so that makes them distinctive, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the other piece to that also, Amy and Steve, you guys would, I think, agree with the fact that other medicines and treatment modalities don't have like a kind of different communities of people doing the treatment underground, and sort of doing sort of self-experimentation and all these things. Like you don't really hear about like underground SSRI therapists or providers or underground ECT providers for that matter. So like there's a whole world that exists that and it's these are folks who know these medicines pretty well, actually. I think that there's a lot of really good underground therapists that are doing good work and helping lots of people. Um, but that also means that there's also like values and kind of traditions, that are embedded in these treatments that maybe aren't quite compatible with mainstream medicine.
Well, Dom, you first of all just created a very rich opportunity of fantasy in my mind of underground ECT and SSRI providers, but I'll think about that more later and probably giggle. But but more relevant and for now, on that point about the ceremonial tradition, the rich history that precedes however we might think about the potential of psychedelics today, certain ways of knowing and the wisdom that's been developed. I'm curious both of your perspectives on, number one, frankly, some of the relevance of that to a medical model in the sense of it lacking the context of those traditions and your thoughts on how that translates across or not. And then two, maybe just that general principle of knowing. Certainly there would also be examples of things that we thought we knew, which turned out when put to the test to not be the case. And I think a lot of the traditional ways of knowing are not being studied right now and more, accepted and of course, valid with the rich history. But again, as we think about a certain context, which is a Western medical model, curious about your thoughts on some of the considerations of the translations between the two.
I mean, I'll go first, I think, but like the idea of importing some of these traditional practices into mainstream medicine at first seems kind of like difficult and not possible, but I do think it is, in terms of just like drawing from the knowledge around set and setting in particular and creating like spaces that are more amenable to the experience and like may enhance outcomes. But you're right. I mean, we have to study that. And so I think that just intention setting and the way that, like, I don't know. I've never been to, like, Amy can tell you way more about this from her experiences in Ecuador, but just having like a methodology for intention setting might be something we can learn from indigenous peoples and how they, use ceremony to get, folks kind of prepared. And it takes, more than just a few minutes. It takes like days sometimes or even weeks. That might be over the sort of, that might be a little bit much, but like the point is there's like, I think, pearls of wisdom that can be drawn from populations that have been using these substances for a long time. And we should make a list of these things and try to like actualize them in practice, while also being reverent and respectful of the tradition and not doing it in a way that's exploitative or just insensitive, because these are like sacraments too. Like, so I think that that's also something we have to keep in mind.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit more skeptical about this. I think that we can take certain things like setting intentions, like, being mindful of your setting that you're in. I guess my thought is sometimes when we try to do that, it gets sort of distorted a little bit into more new age kind of practices than it does really honoring the time-honored traditions of communities. And I think part of that is because in order to do that well, we'd have to really shift our entire sort of worldview and perspective, or at least be open to a broader worldview and perspective. And I guess just one example of this that I would say is my understanding, and I may have this wrong, but my understanding just from the work that I've done with some Indigenous communities is that what's really central to their use of these substances and how they work is being in right relationship with the plants. And the idea that of being in any sort of relationship with plants, right? Let alone a spiritual relationship with plants is really not something that is part of our Western milieu, part of our worldview, our mindset. And I think it would be really challenging to convince, physicians all over the United States that, in order to provide this medication to your patients, you have to have a spiritual relationship or recognize the spirit of the plant and honor that. And so I think that would be really hard to translate, which doesn't mean that I'm not saying that in a normative way, whether that's good or bad. I just think acknowledging that is important. I do think we can create our own ritual and traditions that may be informed by some of the practices, and we see that with like the use of music and the use of different types of settings that people think are important. That I think draws from that. Setting intentions is a great example, Dom, but I think that draws from it, but it's not the same. And what we do and what we mean when we set our intentions is probably quite different from what happens in the jungles or in other traditional communities. But I'd be curious, Steve, I mean, you've been doing these clinical trials. Maybe you can speak a little bit to what ways in which you have tried to learn from traditional communities and practices and ceremony in how you conduct your clinical trials, if at all.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so first, back to your point about right relationships with plants and that being part of the tradition and the use of natural psychedelic substances. One of the things I'm curious about is, in clinical trials that are going on right now, particularly those that are being conducted by manufacturers who are seeking FDA approval of a product to be a therapeutic drug to be delivered by healthcare providers. In almost all cases, these are not plant or fungi-derived substances. In some cases, they are structurally related to, but are fully synthesized. In other cases, they've never existed, at least in their pure form in plants, and they are fully synthetic. And so, that makes me curious about whether there is even appropriate relationship between some of the more traditional practices with natural substances versus, what is, in this case, perhaps inspired in some cases by, but ultimately a synthetic product that's not found in nature. As a disclosure, I am a employee and shareholder in Compass Pathways, which is a biotech company that is developing a synthetic proprietary formulation of psilocybin that we call COMP360, and investigating that for treatment-resistant depression and PTSD and ultimately other mental health conditions, potentially with major unmet need. But we, of course, in pursuing this pathway of an FDA approval, are very much bound in some ways to think about how do these trials need to be designed to demonstrate the safety, efficacy, quality of a drug product, because that is what will be evaluated by an agency like FDA. And of course, that's a necessary first step to potentially create patient access to what may be new treatments. And so within that, it doesn't necessarily leave a ton of latitude to build in tradition. Certainly a major priority is broad and equitable patient access, which I'm still happy to say, even though it's maybe not so popular today. And so with that, it makes it really important to understand the patient voice broadly, including marginalized communities, including those who are currently underserved, recognizing that there are tremendous gaps in healthcare access and being interested in not widening those gaps, but hopefully closing them. And so, that means doing a lot of listening out in the community to those who are waiting and may potentially have access to these new treatments. But I think in other ways, more directly to your question, it is an ongoing question of what is the appropriate way to engage with those who have ceremonial experience with natural substances, and with that, who to engage with in some ways, given that, again, it's the use of these substances is so ubiquitous around the world and over all of time. And naturally, many of these traditions may differ amongst many of these different groups. It's not a monolith.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting question that you ask about sort of, does it matter if it's not the plant product itself, but a synthetic product? And sort of what kind of, and I would say, again, I think that, there's such a difference in sort of how we view the world. People talk about like two ways of seeing, two ways of knowing. And I would guess that there are some communities that would say, that the response to that, or some people, the response to that would be, we're in relationship with everything. And so the fact that it's a chemical compound shouldn't matter in terms of our relationship with it. But I don't know. So it is an interesting question of whether that changes how we think about this.
Thank you for this conversation about the exceptionalism or lack thereof of psychedelics. I'm interested in talking a bit about some of the ethics around the research that, has been going on for the last 20 years, but, really has its origin in research in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Some of the challenges of research during that first phase of psychedelic research, some of those issues kind of still complicate research today. And so we saw, worries about blinding, or what the FDA advisory committee was calling out as functional unblinding. It's really tough to create or develop a study or run a study that is placebo controlled with these substances, of course, right? So that's a methodological limitation that I think has ethical implications. But what are some other ethical challenges, maybe Amy, that you think are really important to keep our eyes on with psychedelic research?
Yeah, I think one thing that has come up over and over, and I think we just need more data on this, is what is the impact of a dosing session on suggestibility? Does it so the argument is that both when you're under the influence of a psychedelic drug and for a period of time after being under the influence, there is sort of this window of suggestibility. And I think a lot of the argument that's been made in the literature is that I think there's been sort of this chain of logic, right? That we know that there is a window where you have sort of neuroplasticity, and it's like the opening window. People assume that means that there's enhanced suggestibility during that time period, and there's been some data to suggest that. And then we kind of jump to the conclusion that therefore that undermines people's autonomy or agency, and may lead to enhanced vulnerability and decision-making that could result in regret or things like that. I think we need a lot more information about that, and we need to study that better in terms of, what is the window of suggestibility, and does that actually undermine agency or autonomy, or does it enhance authenticity, right? Some people have argued that once you take a psychedelic substance, it actually connects you more authentically with what your true values are and beliefs are. And maybe that actually enhances your ability to make decisions that are in your own sort of interest. So I think that's very interesting. And it's a really important research ethics question, because it has implications for, how we treat research participants and what decisions we'll, sort of entrust them with during the process of dosing, as well as in the period post-dosing sessions.
Do you think that in terms of informed consent, then, that you might actually have a patient who is, consenting to one thing? Let's just use the common example that we always used around like therapeutic touch. They consent, let's say, let's say they refuse touch. They say, I don't really want to be touched. But then while they're experiencing their psychedelic dose, they say, yeah, actually I do, like, would you hug me, or would you hold my hand, or would you? So that's what you're arguing essentially, Amy, is that the person who's experienced, who's having the psychedelic experience, might actually be more of the person, the authentic person, than the one who consented or refused touch. So like I guess you would listen to the person who's tripping.
So I'm not actually arguing that. I'm saying I think that's an open question.
Extension of
It's
the
an
argument.
open question about whether that's true. So, I think there needs to be some clear boundaries that are professional boundaries in any clinical trial or any clinical practice, right? So, for example, and we've seen this in sort of the popular press and in the literature, that, there's been some examples of sexual transgressions by therapists during sessions and post-session. I don't think that should ever be tolerated. There should never be sexual relationships between providers and their patients or clients. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. There's lots of transference, countertransference. There's vulnerability that naturally comes from the state of being a patient in the care of somebody who you're entrusting. That's a relationship it's a fiduciary relationship that should be held in trust. And even in research, I think that fiduciary-like relationship exists. So I think there are certain boundaries. Now, if I decide like I really could use a hug right now, or, I could really use somebody to just hold my hand for a second, and it's done in a professional way, I'm less concerned about that decision. I think we touch people all the time in medicine. I think it's actually a very important part of healing in medical practice. And to treat the psychedelic experience differently because the person is under the influence of a drug is probably not appropriate. But that said, I think it should be consented to in the moment, right? Where let's say if you don't think that you can give consent in the moment, because some people might argue that, it should at least be authorized. So you never, if somebody's sort of really out of it and you come up, you shouldn't be laying hands on them without their sort of knowledge and permission and things like that. So yeah, that's how I feel about touch. But I know it's a very complicated topic that people feel very, very differently about.
Yeah, I mean, those are great points. And, Dom, I'm really glad actually that you had opened this conversation with the concept of psychedelic exceptionalism, because to circle back to, a couple of the points that you and Amy have been making, I think it's helpful to also consider them through that lens. Are we potentially applying standards to psychedelics that are not the unique domain of psychedelics? You raised the challenges of blinding psychedelic trials, that it's, very easy for a participant to tell the difference between a high-dose active psychedelic experience and a true placebo. And you referenced the advisory committee for the review of Lykos's application of MDMA for PTSD. And during that, of course, we heard the FDA acknowledge that these trials are difficult to blind. It's also, of course, been pointed out in the wake of that psychedelics aren't the only substances which are relatively unblinding. And we had a recent approval of the ketamine product, S-ketamine, Spravato, which, of course, is unblinding. But really almost any psychotropic drug is unblinding. Atypical antipsychotics, certainly. So this is really always a challenge. And I think it raises maybe a broader question of the importance of maintaining a blind and how you interpret data when that blind may be broken. It's also led to some innovation in trial design to help minimize unblinding, which appears to be somewhat successful, particularly if you're using multiple active doses, as was also recommended by FDA. But then, in addition, this idea of suggestibility and the vulnerability of patients in that suggestible state, both in terms of the acute experience, as well as, Amy, as you mentioned, in potentially a period of plasticity following. These also, even though they may be a different type of vulnerability or altered state, it's not unique. Of course, patients routinely receive short-acting anesthetics or dissociatives as part of medical procedures. As just one example, hypnotherapy, what happens in an ongoing psychotherapeutic relationship, et cetera. As far as the window of plasticity, of course, also many, many things potentially open windows of plasticity. exercise creates a neuroplastic state in the brain, methamphetamine, all kinds of things. And so, maybe in some ways, psychedelics help to turn our attention to relatively mundane experiences that we haven't been sensitive enough to, because perhaps those things also are leaving people in relatively vulnerable states. So just a couple of thoughts from me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Steve. I mean, I do also, like the touch issue, as Amy alluded to, that's not an exceptional issue either, right? We worry about that in any relationship where there's a vulnerable individual, and in the case of psychedelics, I think the question isn't really about, we know the answer to touch, I mean, and sex, like, but I think the question is, how do we make sure that we train up the right people and have, investigators and therapists who have the sort of moral integrity to do this work really, correctly, because you are you are really like the caretaker of somebody who's utterly vulnerable for that period of time. And that's a huge responsibility, which is also probably why we need some guidelines around the licensing and credentialing of these folks, which I think is another topic we should probably talk about, which, is something that is still not really out there yet. I mean, I guess there aren't any approved psychedelics yet, so that could be partly why, but anticipating the approval of maybe psilocybin or MDMA eventually, I think means we probably should start thinking about the workforce that's going to be providing these treatments.
So, Dom, can I jump in with a question for you guys, actually? Because I think that, one of the things also that the FDA panel was concerned about with the Lykos new drug application review was the fact that Lykos submitted MDMA-assisted therapy, right? And it was the therapeutic component of FDA doesn't regulate therapy. They regulate drugs and drug products. And so if we really think that these drugs work best or work only in the context of a therapeutic protocol, how can we best study that and regulate that? And so I'm just kind of curious, post the Lykos decision, maybe Steve, you can help us a little bit with this. Like, what has been the drug companies that are out there, what has been their perspective on trying to better understand the role of therapy? And this also relates to Dom's question about licensure, because if we really think that there's a particular type of therapy that is important here, then that might change how we think about licensure of who can provide that type of therapy, versus if we just think psychological support is what's important here, or just having somebody in the room or something to that effect.
It's a terrific question, Amy. And I think it's one where diving into the details may help with it, because the details matter. So, for example, with Lykos's MDMA submission, MDMA is not a classical psychedelic. It's sometimes referred to as an empathogen or an entactogen. The nature of the experience of MDMA is one that typically would open someone up. It helps to reduce ego boundaries. It facilitates dialogue. And the hypothesis put forward by Lykos is that it was a combination treatment, a combination of a drug with a psychotherapy, and that the drug catalyzed this process of psychotherapy. And that's something that probably makes sense in the context of a drug that creates that kind of experience. That is probably pretty sharply contrasted with the typical experience of a classical psychedelic, which tends to be more inwardly directed, inwardly focused. It's generally more self-directed, self-driven as somebody goes through that experience, and doesn't particularly lend itself to an active dialogue with someone else in the room during the experience itself. So that's an important contrast. And I think that the recognition of that has led the developers of classical psychedelics to approach this somewhat differently, and potentially in a way that makes the evaluation of drug safety and efficacy a little bit cleaner as it's detached from a standalone psychotherapy. So some manufacturers have used models of psychological support, which is intended to reflect that it's primarily a container to safeguard patients during this process. In sessions prior to the drug administration, really focusing on building some trust and rapport, providing some psychoeducation, given that most participants in these trials have not had previous psychedelic experiences, helping them understand the range of experience that might occur over the course of the trial, and how the therapist will support them during that. During the drug administrations themselves, those tend to be largely silent, and the role of the person in the room is primarily to maintain physical and psychological safety, to safeguard the patient during that time, and to help keep their attention focused on the experience. There's a term, experiential avoidance, a tendency perhaps for somebody who's having an anxious or a challenging experience to divert their attention away from it. And so it can be helpful to have your attention gently guided back to that experience. But that, of course, is very different than an active psychotherapy. And then in the follow-up after, which is sometimes referred to as integration, although integration, probably in the more traditional sense, would refer to a longer process that really extends beyond the time of most of these trials. In the trials, it's primarily aimed, again, at safeguarding, at following patients up, at ensuring that there isn't the persistence of perceptual changes that could be concerning, that there aren't other acute safety risks present. And some manufacturers even go to the extent of saying they don't even provide psychological support. Now, that's, maybe could be debated as well. I mean, I would argue that even when you prescribe an SSRI to someone, really any treatment, there's some form of psychological support there, right? We always are preparing patients for what they're consenting to or for the treatment they may receive, supporting them during that and following up with them afterwards. So again, maybe not exceptional to psychedelics, but again, at least there's that differentiation, I think, in models that are being used in clinical trials right now, which fall more into that support domain than psychotherapy, which isn't to say that there isn't likely a role for psychotherapy if these products are approved, and particularly in that period after the administration, perhaps when there are these open windows of plasticity and people are really open to the consolidation of some of these experiences and further work following after that. But most of these trials will leave off at that point of having followed patients up with appropriate care to follow afterwards.
So Steve, if it's as a follow-up question, right? So if we think that it's the drug that's really doing the work here, and I'm not disagreeing with you, but we know that the vast majority of people who are using psychedelics are using it sort of, quote, in the wild, right? In the underground or recreationally. And there seems to be, at least anecdotally, a difference between getting together with a bunch of friends, taking a heroic dose of mushrooms and going to a rock concert, right? And having a good night, versus doing this therapeutically and having really sort of profound effects on reduction in symptoms for, depression, for example. Is that true? And if it is true, then what's the difference there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. Certainly anecdotally, it's true. I don't know if there are head-to-head comparisons to demonstrate the difference, but there's certainly theoretical reasons to believe that's true, and maybe supported by some non-clinical imaging data that's available at this point. What I have in mind is there was a recent paper in Nature by Siegel et al. I forget the exact title, but it talks about the desynchronization of the brain under psychedelics. And what he showed with functional MRI was that if people were able to attend to the experience, then they were able to have this desynchronization followed by this period of plasticity. But if they were distracted by a task, then they did not. And perhaps in those uncontrolled settings out in the wild, there are lots of distractions which might distract people from attending to that experience. And going back to what I was saying before about experiential avoidance and why, one of the important roles of the person in the room may be just to help people stay present in that moment, focused on that experience. And then, other elements of preparation, which don't tend to happen in the wild, right? With people really in a mindset where they are open to, curious about, feeling ready to have this type of experience, perhaps having set an intention, which they might be able to stick with or not. But I would guess that some of those variables might explain some of that difference.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
But we don't know, right?
Yeah. Don, do you think that there are other major sort of research ethics questions that we're missing here in terms of?
Not really. I think one that came up again with Lycos was just like subject selection, which is an ethical issue. When we're designing trials, we want to have equitable, access for folks who maybe are carrying a heavy burden of whatever disorder we're trying to study, whether it's PTSD, depression, et cetera. And, I think Lycos made a politically smart move by focusing their work, and this was MAPS really at the time, on combat veterans who obviously have a huge, burden of PTSD that many, many veterans suffer, their families, their spouses, they all are affected by this horrible condition. And it made sense that they should be involved in the studies. On the other hand, there's lots of other folks, populations that maybe have experienced horrible trauma as well, or it might not be combat related, but it might be, gender-based violence or racism or just, the traumas involved in being a critical care doctor during COVID or whatever it might be. These are like also traumas. And I just sort of pushed a little bit back on the selection of veterans exclusively because of this kind of political motivation that maybe overrode what I think would have been a more scientifically sound approach of diversifying the participant pool a bit more. So I don't know, it's a debatable point because I think recruiting veterans was like, it enabled or it sort of generated a lot of bipartisan support for these very controversial substances. So that outcome is very positive, right? That's a big thing. But like at what point do political considerations or should political considerations factor into questions around study design, right? That's an interesting question to me.
Yeah. You also, I think that's a really important question. You also, though, raised another point, which is regardless of the population that's experiencing trauma, it's never just an individual, right? And on our sort of Western way of practicing medicine is very individualistic. Trauma in particular, but most illnesses are very relational. And so I think there's also an open question of how do you involve family members in the treatment itself. And, I've heard anecdotally people who have run clinical trials of psychedelics and, the spouse or whoever has been really part of this journey will see, the person who's getting treatment get better and be like, wait, what about me? Like, I've been going through this with you and I'm experiencing the same things. And why am I being left behind here? So I don't know, Steve, if you guys are thinking about sort of more relational approaches, to treatment. But I think that's going to be really key when we have approval.
Well, I love that you brought that up. And I think it actually, in some ways, circles us back to some of the things we were talking about earlier about some of the considerations for vulnerability of patients under psychedelics, issues of consent. And, to answer your question directly, it sometimes can be a difficult thing to include within registrational clinical trials that need to be highly standardized. But, certainly in thinking about how these models translate from clinical trial environments to the real world, if they're approved, I fully agree with you. I mean, drawing on some of my clinical experience, in the past, I was involved in treating a lot of patients with ketamine. Which in some ways, clinically is a pretty similar model to what's being looked at in clinical trials today. And something I always encouraged my patients to do, if they were willing, was to include trusted friends, family, et cetera, in the course of their care, from the initial appointment through the discussion of informed consent, inviting them to be in the room if that was welcomed. To help support during that time as somebody known and trusted, and also in the follow-up period to help with understanding the change that may have happened and how that can now be contextualized and integrated into their life going forward. I mean, especially with somebody who's been living with a severe mental illness for a very long period of time, it vastly, drastically alters the course and the composition of your life. And so it's one of those cases where careful what you wish for, because even if there's the hope for outcome of benefit from the treatment, there's now a whole new set of circumstances to adjust to, which can be incredibly stressful and calls for a lot of support. So yeah, I mean, even if it's a bit challenging to formally study that within the context of these types of trials, it is my hope that that clinicians will recognize the potential richness of that, as well as some of the potential protections of patients receiving these treatments as it moves into the real world.
Yeah, I think that's great, Steve. I mean, the clinical aspects of this mean that that patients can expect, or family members maybe should be prepared to see their loved one change dramatically. And I think this gets us to informed consent a little bit too, which is to say, the patient may not realize that they're in a really abusive relationship or have a job that's causing them to feel horrible stress all the time. And they might come away with the realization that that's the case, and then change their relationships, end a marriage, leave a job, do big things that maybe will come as a surprise to some folks in their lives, their family members, their community. And the relational aspect, again, Amy, this is all kind of hanging together, I think points in the direction of educating the unit, almost like a systems therapy approach, maybe, if the system isn't toxic, right? Like, you wouldn't want to have family members around that are the problem. But assuming that it's not the case, that, yeah, I mean, I think that this is an interesting moment where clinicians can start to branch out and think, more systematically. And I think group therapy with psychedelics might be really helpful too. I think there's all kinds of modalities that involve lots of other people, that not lots of other people, but other people that may actually engender this kind of, notion of relationality and beginning the process of healing already while you're in the experience by interacting with other people.
Yeah.
So I don't know. There's a lot here, I think, from a clinical ethics standpoint that challenges the model of individual treatment, basic kind of informed consent standards that maybe we need to enhance a little bit or just tweak. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think there's some really interesting work now being done with the use of MDMA, in particular with couples therapy, which I think is really exciting work. Some of that work was done in the 1960s before sort of the shutdown of the research, and it's being revived. And I think that could be very beneficial. I just wanted to circle back on the group therapy, because I think people are starting to look at that. And, we've done a lot of work in the unregulated space, looking at psychedelic retreats that are happening both in the United States and in the environment where it's not legal, but also through medical tourism into countries where there's more permissive regulations around the use of these substances. Those are almost uniformly done in a group setting. Not always, but usually they're done in a group setting. And what's really interesting in some of the work that we've done is I think the group itself is a very, very powerful tool for healing. And it's this idea that, we don't in our society have opportunities for really stripped down, authentic, meaningful connection with other human beings. And when you're with a group of people and you're doing something as vulnerable as taking a substance that's going to put you into an altered state of consciousness, and you're talking about some of your issues, that you're trying to work through, and that substance may be helping you to work through, it's a very, very sort of quick way to get into this kind of meaningful connection that I think we lack in our daily lives. And it can be extremely bonding. And I've seen cases of, groups that have gone on retreat together and they've stayed in touch for years and years and years after just spending, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days together. someplace. And so I think there is some work now being done of like, what is the role of group therapy? It's also much more, it's much more affordable to do this in a group setting, because the number of provider hours that you need gets drastically reduced. And so it might be a really great way to increase access once we have FDA approval, as well as being efficacious in other ways.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be really interesting to explore. Also, to think about it based upon what component of treatment maybe in a group setting versus individual. Is it people being prepared together, actually in the same space or aware of each other during administration? Are these groups in the integration period? I mean, I think in U.S. healthcare, we often quickly jump to HIPAA. Everyone just says HIPAA, privacy. How can you do these things? Neglecting the the reality of HIPAA, which is that it doesn't really exist to protect privacy so much as the portability of information. And hopefully healthcare providers have always been concerned with maintaining patients' privacy. And so, yes, even within the frameworks of privacy laws, it is possible to do these things. The economic question is an interesting one. If we take the precedent of psychotherapy and look at the economics of individual psychotherapy versus group, it's not always more efficient or cost effective to deliver things as groups, given that, unfortunately, unlike other fields of medicine within psychiatry and psychology, typically payer reimbursement of somebody participating in a group is just a fraction of what they would pay for individual therapy. And so with the added complexity of running a group, typically with more than one leader of that group, et cetera, the numbers start to get funky when you're actually looking at insurance reimbursed care. But that's not by way to say, not to shut that argument down so much as to say that it's complex. And I agree. I think there's a lot of really cool opportunities to look at many different models of delivering these treatments if they're approved, and how beyond any difference in the nature of the drug itself and hopefully incremental improvements in what's available to patients, it may help drive innovation in care delivery, which may provide for much richer and longer lasting benefits for patients than the way that care is delivered today. I know that we are pushing up on the hour here. I am not shocked at all that we are still going and probably could keep going for hours more with the two of you, but also with such a rich subject. But given the timing, do either or both of you have any parting words?
Go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, so I'll start. So I think, I guess my only parting words, because my understanding is, that there might be some healthcare providers out there listening to this saying, what is all this psychedelic stuff? And, I think that it really is important and incumbent on us to make sure that all healthcare providers are aware of these treatments, both because I think we will see FDA approval. And there will be a lot of people interested in receiving this treatment once there is FDA approval, but also because there is such a large number of people who are already accessing these drugs in the unregulated space. And, these are very powerful substances. And if people don't feel comfortable talking to their healthcare providers about what they're doing in the unregulated space, it could have potentially really unsafe consequences with regard to their other pre-existing medical conditions, medications that they're on, and other medical management. So I would just encourage all healthcare providers to sort of educate themselves about what these substances are and to open up the lines of communication with their patients about these things, because I think that more and more people will start looking for access, either in the regulated or unregulated space.
Yeah, a really important message. Thanks, Amy. And Dom?
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I just think that, the basic point here is these are really promising new treatments for people who are suffering from horrible mental health conditions that I think we need to really open our minds and our imaginations up to ways to make these medicines accessible to as many people as possible, given, as Amy started out talking about, the mental health crisis in our country and the fact that, the current treatments are good, but they're not great. And I also think that the mechanisms by which these substances work are just different and better potentially. Remains to be seen, but I think the signals are pointing to better than like an SSRI, for example. And so given those points, I feel like there's almost a responsibility here for clinicians to really get on board, at least know the material, the sort of background, the risks, the benefits, and begin the process of educating patients who maybe would benefit from these substances once they are in fact available. The last thing I would say is the field needs an ethics infrastructure that will help it be sustainable. I worry that there'll be some, ethics transgressions that will stunt the development of the science and progress in terms of getting access to people, like it kind of did in the 60s and 70s, right? So I don't want that to happen again. So I think it's important that we have, constant conversations about ethics and psychedelics. Not to say that they're super exceptional, but the history points to some not great things happening. So, it'd be good to get out in front of all that stuff so that people can be healed.
Absolutely. And at minimum, maybe this is also calling for a part 2 of psychedelic medical ethics unpacked at some point, because there's probably more we can say as things progress. So in the meantime, I want to thank Amy so much for being an amazing guest today. Thank you for taking this time with us. Thank you to the audience for tuning in and for listening, and stay tuned for more episodes of Medical Ethics Unpacked.